Can you give me an example of Albanese's support for Hamas and terrorism and racism?
Sure. I'll give you several examples. First, on terrorism. On the day of October 7th, her immediate instinct was to justify what Hamas was doing. What? She rushed to Twitter and she said, whoa, everyone's condemning Hamas, but you have to understand. You have to understand what the context is. You have to understand the context. They've been repressed. The Palestinians, Gaza have been oppressed, and they're responding to brutality. That was her theme on October 7th and was consistent for the past 2 years. Yes, on certain occasions, she made a token condemnation of what Hamas did, but her instinct on that day was to justify what Hamas did.
And what's her real power at the UN?
Her power is that she has used the imprimatur of the name of the United Nations, used their legitimacy to promote the Hamas narrative, the Hamas lies. Every Hamas lie within minutes was promoted by Francesca Albanese. She, for example, the notorious case of 2 weeks after October 7th, actually 10 days after, when a hospital, there was a report that Israel bombs hospital, the Al-Ali hospital. Yes. This is October 17th, 2023. Israel bombs hospital, 500 people killed. That was the report that went around the world, including the New York Times. And everything about it was false. Everything about it was false. Israel did not bomb a hospital. There was a bomb. It was by the jihad. Islamic Jihad fired a rocket against Israel. It fell short, as happens on many occasions. Fell short, and it hit not the hospital, but the parking lot. 500 people weren't killed, maybe 10, maybe more. The moment people realized it wasn't Israel, nobody cared anymore. But Francesca Albanese is someone who helped promote that lie, and many others since then. She has written at times that Israel killed 186,000 people, Israel killed 300,000 people, just making up wild numbers.
What? During this war?
During this war.
What she claimed that many people had been killed in Gaza.
Yes, she said.
Even Hamas don't claim that.
Yes, there was a report came out that if you add the people who could have been born and facilities that were hit and how it hits people's lives, then she just sort of conflated that into Israel's responsible for killing 186,000 people. These are among the things she said. When there were the wildfires in LA, somehow she was promoting things that blamed Israel somehow for the wildfires in LA. So this is someone who's really devoted and dedicated to the proposition that Israel is evil. She has been accusing Israel of genocide long before the Gaza war, at least 10 years before, when she was active on social media. She was comparing the plight of the Palestinians to the Holocaust. And so this she's been doing for a long time. About anti-Semitism, she wrote in 2014 to promote UNRWA, where she had once worked, this UN agency, which we should be talking about a little bit. She said that America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. I'll say that again. America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. That's not like modern, contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. This is classic 1930s anti-Semitism. America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. Wow. And for statements like that, comparing Israel repeatedly to the Third Reich, she's been condemned, the first UN expert in history to be condemned by France, Germany, Canada, and other countries for both anti-Semitism and Holocaust inversion. And just yesterday, the New York Times had a fawning profile of her that was a complete whitewash.
Is she get-riddable?
Yes. In theory, the Human Rights Council could have decided not to renew her mandate. The Human Rights Council at any moment could meet and dismiss her. However, they do the opposite. As I indicated, when objections were made, they basically flushed them down the toilet and ignored them. And that's the reality. Of course, who sits on the Human Rights Council? When people hear the words UN Human Rights Council, many around the world imagine men with long white beards, dressed in white robes, strolling along Mount Olympus, making the UN Human Rights Council, making their decisions based on facts, logic, and morality. When Winston, nothing could be further from the truth, when those sitting around the table at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva are not Aristotle, Socrates, or Plato, but the Chinese communist regime, Cuban communist regime, the Qataris. They just elected Egypt and Pakistan and Iraq, some of the worst abusers of human rights. And no surprise, they're the ones who are very happy to have people like Albanese and many others like her.
So it seemed to me from the start, and we'll come back to anti-Semitism within the UN, but it seems to me from the start that, as you say, it never really properly existed, but it seemed to me that it was almost this concept of international law or the UN, these sort of groups, it was sort of doomed to fail because everyone except perhaps the West, but even the West, are only ever going to operate in their own interests. And so, I mean, that's human nature to a certain extent. And I would say it's also the responsibility of the sovereign of each nation or the representative of each nation to represent their nation. So how exactly can you have nations adjudicating over international issues without some sort of bias, or them, they're not a judge that is removed. You can't be removed from all issues, right?
They're not independent,
They're not independent,
partial, or disinterested.
Exactly.
The opposite. And as you said, it's normal and natural that a country would look out for their interests first. That is true. Look, the United Nations is a political body, and anyone expecting more than that is going to be disappointed. And even their institutions that claim to be about justice, they did create the international. Well, I don't know if they created it, but the ICJ is part of the United Nations today, the International Court of Justice, and it sounds like the World Court, and we would think it's impartial. But they have judges there from China and other communist regimes who are agents of the regime. So if a democracy appoints a judge, he or she may well be impartial. But certainly many of the judges sitting there, for example, there were Lebanon, had their former ambassador to the UN who voted against Israel 160 times and killed resolutions for victims in Iran and other places, or at least opposed those resolutions. And then the next day he became a judge on the World Court and was sitting in judgment on Israel. When a normal, if principles of justice and the rule of law applied, he would say, well, first of all, he shouldn't have been appointed and elected as a judge, but even if he were appointed, when Israel came before the court with being accused of genocide and other crimes, his reaction ought to be, I must recuse myself. That's what in a court in the UK or in Canada or the US where I practiced, if a judge had if there was a reasonable basis to apprehend there may be bias or perceived bias, the judge should recuse himself. And at the ICJ, at the UN, that never happened. So the UN itself is a political body, and even their institutions that are supposed to apply justice themselves are often subverted.
Is there value to keeping it, but being honest that it is a political body, and not just the UN, but the ICC and the ICJ? Or can they be reformed? Or is there do we need them at all? Does the world need these organizations? And it sounds drastic a question, but
it is a drastic question, but it's a question we have to ask. There is no institution that should be immune from the question of, are you fit for purpose? And what was the purpose in 1945 and what is being achieved today? If you look at the UN, its founders, many of them were noble idealists. Certainly, Eleanor Roosevelt was the founding chair of the Human Rights Commission in 1946. Her vice chair was René Cassin, French legal philosopher. And if you fast forward from 1946, which in its early years, they adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they met in Geneva after World War II to reaffirm the principles of human dignity. So the founders were noble. You fast forward to 2003, several decades later, it's no longer a body made up of idealists, but of governments only. The Human Rights Commission became governments. And the chair was a representative, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, the brutal Libyan dictator. So 1946, Eleanor Roosevelt, 2003, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's representative, the rise and fall of human rights at the UN. And so we should be asking, what can be done with this body? So our group, UN Watch, based in Geneva, with a special focus on the Human Rights Council, we've asked democracies, do something. When China, Cuba, Qatar get nominated, and Vladimir Putin many times was nominated and sat on the Human Rights Council, and Chavez and Maduro from Venezuela, serial abusers of human rights, we said, vote against them, lead a campaign to block them. And in most cases, the democracies, Britain, France, Germany, said nothing. On the contrary, when the French president, whether it was Macron or his predecessor, were asked about some dictator being elected, they said, well, the UN is a universal body and everyone should be allowed to be there. Well, actually not true. The Human Rights Council, when it was reformed, used to be called the Human Rights Commission. June 2006 was revamped, made into the new and improved Human Rights Council. They said there's criteria. not everyone gets on. You have to make the case that you have human rights credentials, and when you're a member, you're obliged to live up to the highest standards of human rights. And there's elections, and you can be removed for committing gross and systematic violations. So there are criteria, but the European countries, by and large, ignore that. And what they do at the UN is they go along to get along. So we've been asking them to take minimal steps for reform, and they don't do it. So you ask me today, is there hope for reform? To be honest, currently, I don't see it.
Thanks for watching this clip from The Winston Marshall Show. You can click here to watch the full episode, and for more clips like this one, don't forget to subscribe. And as always, be well.